for joining us for this workshop on dry farming vineyards in California. My name is Catherine Van Dyke. I'm the Director of Water Policy at CAF, and I'll be your moderator for today. So, like Evan said, please feel free to put questions into that Q&A button down at the bottom. The format for today, we've got three experts in the field that I'm so excited to hear from. Lauren Pesch from Leeds and Pesch Vineyards, Miguel Garcia from Napa County Resource Conservation District, and Chad Tabor from Adelaida Vineyards. We will hear from each of our speakers. Each of them will present, and we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A right after they wrap up, and then some time at the end for sort of general questions and more thoughts that are coming up. So we're going to kick things off with Lauren. Lauren Leeds Pesch is a fourth-generation grape grower based in Rutherford, California. Having grown up on one of the first organic certified ranches in the Napa Valley, Lauren has witnessed the quality benefits derived from working in concert with the vine. She shares these experiences with her consulting clients through her viticulture consulting company, Leeds and Pesch Vineyards. She's an outspoken proponent of both organic and dry farming practices and believes them to be a cornerstone to unlocking the potential of many vineyard sites. Take it away, Lauren.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you everyone for joining us. So again, my name is Lauren Pesch. I am a grower in Napa, and I am also a project manager for a dry farming project that's being funded by the Department of Water Resources and being implemented by CAF and CSWA. So I first wanted to start off with the definition of dry farming. So dry farming is a farming technique that relies solely on utilizing the water naturally present in the soil, captured by the rain, to meet the needs of an established vine without irrigation. In a Mediterranean climate with dry summers, this requires capturing winter and spring rain. This long-standing practice encourages deep root growth, resulting in high-quality grapes that reflect the terroir of the vineyard. And a little bit about the project. So again, it's a 3-year project that's being funded by the Department of Water Resources, and some of our objectives are to build a dry farming expertise and network. So we have an advisory group from growers all over the state of California. We are also working directly with growers for dry farming consultation. So I will talk a little bit more about that towards the end of my presentation. We've been developing dry farming research studies and educational resources. We are hosting workshops and webinars, and we are creating quite a few dry farming educational videos. And we're also just working on just communicating and promoting the adoption of dry farming practices to lessen water usage. So the idea of this project is not to have everybody become a dry farmer. Obviously, that's not doable in some cases. So, but the idea is that people can learn maybe using some dry farming techniques, and then their water usage will not be as great. So one of the really cool things that we've developed with this dry farming project is our dry farming potential map. So we're working with Land IQ on this, and they've mapped out the entire state of California with every known vineyard block. And then they have highlighted all of the known dry farm vineyards in California. So this is still a work in process. It's we're every dry farm vineyard that we know of and that is on this map. But of course, there's a lot more out there. So if there's something that's missing, please reach out to me. My email will be at the end of the presentation. The idea of this map, so this is a zoomed in portion of it, is that you can look at where your vineyard is. You can see if there are if there are dry farm vineyards in your area. So here is a snapshot of a Rutherford in the Napa Valley, and everything that is has a green border with the little icon is a known dry farm vineyard. So you are able to click on this vineyard. So this is one of my vineyards, so Chavez and Leeds family vineyard. It can tell you everything about the vineyard. So the years that our vines were planted, the varieties. When you scroll down, it tells you the rootstock that we have, the spacing of the vineyard, dry farming, or just our farming practices. And it also gives you contact information if the grower agreed to it. So the idea of this is that you can be curious about dry farming and you're able to see what people in your area are doing and then reach out to them. So this is all on the CSWA dry farming website. I put it in the chat at the start of this. So if you're interested to take a look, please do and let me know if you have any questions. And then some of the research that we're doing. So you'll hear from Miguel with Napa RCD on his research, but they're working on water holding capacity and soil moisture of dry farm vineyards, and also looking at soil health in Napa, Sonoma, and Mendocino. And like I said, he'll elaborate more on that after my presentation. We are working with UC Berkeley and the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory on the relationship of carbon and water in dry farm vineyards. And then we're doing cost analysis of establishing a dry farm vineyard and transitioning a previously irrigated vineyard to a dry farm vineyard. So you can see what the costs are of that. And we're also looking at groundwater recharge. So some of the benefits of dry farming: deep roots. So a dry farm vineyard has very, very deep roots. And this is always something that I've known kind of anecdotally. So I've assumed that my vineyard has deep roots because of when we've ripped one out and seen the roots, but just knowing that it's able to access so much of the soil moisture and the soil profile. But with this project and what Miguel will talk about is we've been digging soil pits in the vineyard, and we see that these vines go down, these roots of these vines go down 4, 5, 6 feet deep, and they're big, and they're not just below the vine, but they're going throughout the vineyard. And you can see there's the picture on the top left, that's Riggs from Emeritus, and he dug a soil pit for one of our workshops, and there were roots going deep, deep down. Water retention. So we're able to retain water from the spring, from those spring and winter rains, and we're able to use it throughout the growing season. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Vine longevity. So dry farm vines, they last a long time. So my vineyards are 40 years old, and the average lifespan of a Napa Valley vineyard is 22 years old. So 22 years. So you get these super long-lived vines. And we all know as grape growers, one of the most expensive parts of farming is when you have to replant and the whole replanting process. So if you don't have to do that as often, it's definitely a cost saving. And you can see there's a 100-year-old vine in the top right from Mendocino. Pest management. So the majority of root dwelling pests are in the first few, like 1 or 2 feet of soil. And if your roots are in those first couple feet of soil, you're more susceptible to a lot of those root dwelling pests like nematodes and phylloxera. And so if you get your roots, the main of your roots out of that area, you can kind of withstand those better. And also weed control. So when we farm in our vineyard, we hoe plow and cultivate when the spring rains are done, and we don't apply water throughout the dry season, and so we don't have any weed regrowth. So a really hard part about being organic is weed control, and if that's something that you don't have to worry about, it's a big step towards becoming organic. Um, Gophers. We at our vineyard, we don't deal with gophers because we are cultivating and it's moving day, right? I mean, my gardens are another story because they all go into my garden, but in the vineyards, we don't have gophers setting up shop. And then in the bottom right corner is a picture of a dry farmed vine next to an irrigated vine. And I'm not saying that all irrigated roots look like this, but you can see that these roots went to where the water was, right? They went to where where the emitter was. And so you have these roots in kind of a ball under the emitter, where if you don't irrigate that vine, they go down and it's very expansive. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we establish a dry farm vineyard because this is one of the most important parts of being able to successfully dry farm. So we prep the field, we rip the soil after we've put compost and cover crop in, and we let that plot go fallow for at least a year. So to really just kind of reset. And then rootstock selection. So we our favorite rootstock that we use is St. George. It's a great dry farm rootstock, but you can use 110R, 140 Regari, 10114. There's a lot. What I've learned from this project is a lot of people are using a lot of different rootstocks to successfully dry farm. Um, Spacing. So we I've always been told by my family, a kind of a rule of thumb is that we need about 50 square feet to successfully dry farm. So if that's, 8 by 6 or 10 by 5 or whatever it is, you kind of need that spacing. But in this project, we have people who are dry farming at tighter spacing. So it's not always, it's really dependent on your vineyard site. And so we plant the rootstock and in the spring, and we let it go until the fall. So we really are trying to establish the root growth and encourage the roots to go down and not growth upward. And so then we bud in the fall, and then we do water a dry farm vineyard for the first 2 years at in our site. So the way we water is we had this water cart. So this picture in the bottom left is a water cart that we had specially made. And we have our crew dig a little basin around each vine or rootstock. We put in about 5 gallons of water. We let it saturate down so the water's really going down into the soil profile, and then we cover the hole up. And we do that twice the first year and probably just once the second year. Obviously, this is very dependent on the year. If you have a really wet, cool year, you might get away with not watering it that second year. If you are in a drought situation, you might have to water it a third time. But usually it's about 2 times watering and then never watered again.
Lauren, just before you leave this slide, someone in the chat is asking, what is rootstock?
Oh, so rootstock is what we have to plant now. So you used to be able just to plant a grapevine, bare rooted and it could grow. And now because of diseases like phylloxera, we have these rootstocks that you need to graft the variety onto. So these rootstocks are resilient to different types of pests and things like that. There's all different rootstocks for different areas. If you're by a river and you have deep soils or if you have shallow soils, but we need it in our area to be able to grow grapevines, right? And be resistant to phylloxera. And let me Okay, so then our farming practices, and I know Chad will talk a little bit more about how they do it at his vineyard, but this is just kind of a brief overview of how we farm on our vineyard. So in the spring, we mow, we disc, and we hoe plow. So mowing's on the left there. There's a picture of our disc in the center, and then a hoe plow, so a French plow, goes in between the vines, and that's how you get underneath the vine row. Um, and it's a great tool. And then we'll go through and we'll disc again, and we'll put an extra disc at the end, and we'll push all the dirt back, and it essentially smothers all of the weeds. And since we, like I said before, since we don't water, we don't have any weed regrowth. Um, and then we cultivate throughout the growing season. So what we're really doing is we're breaking the soil down, and we put this, it's almost like creating a dust mulch on the top. And you can see that in this picture, there's dry soil. So on the right hand side, there's dry soil, and they're going through and they're cultivating, and you're seeing the moisture essentially like wick up. Um, and so we cultivate probably like 4 or 5 times throughout the season. And on this picture on the left, you can see here's a dry farm vine that we're in August, and it hasn't been watered since it was, a baby, and it's doing really well. It set a really heavy crop. We had to thin this block, and we're able to have moisture throughout the growing season. And then a really important part of our practices is that we plant a cover crop and apply compost every fall. Miguel will talk about the soil health of dry farm vineyards. And I know that sometimes people push back about cultivating and disking a vineyard, but our soils are really healthy, and we make sure of that. So this is a cover crop in our vineyard from last year, and it's was up to my chest. We apply compost. We have very, very healthy soils. And then, like I mentioned before, we are part of this project pays for technical assistance. So if you are interested in having someone come out and talk to you about dry farming, it's my vineyard company takes care of Northern California, and then we have Steve Gleisman, who's from the Cuyamas Valley. He consults in Central and Southern California. So if you want somebody to come out for free and just talk about dry farming, you're not signing up to dry farm. It's not, a commitment to dry farm. But if you're interested and you want to talk about your site, then we're here to talk about it with you. So thank you. Can answer any questions.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, we had a few questions come in. So if you're out there with more burning questions, feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A. One question that came through is dryland vineyards may be easier, may establish better on the coast where there's a lower evapotranspiration rate and more dew. A dryland vineyard could be more challenging in Central Valley, such as Lodi. Is there a guideline for a soil type that can be dryland farmed, a certain percent clay or depth to the water table?
So yeah, I mean, water retention is really important for a dry farm vineyard. There are vineyards in Lodi that dry farm. There's not a lot of them, I don't think, but there's, farther, I think it's about spacing, right? Giving your vineyard more access to soil moisture. So in some of those places where it's drier, you might have 12 by 12, right? So the Cuyamas Valley, that's very, very dry. It so where Steve Gleisman, one of our consultants, his vineyard is. So they're able to dry farm, but they have a bigger spacing on it. And they really capture those winter and spring rains and seal with a dust mulch and seal in the moisture that they have.
Thanks, Lauren. Another one that came through that Chad responded to, but want to give you the chance to respond to as well, is have you seen 1103P be successfully dry farmed?
Yes, there are farmers out there that have been able to dry farm that. Is that what Chad said?
Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
good.
Yeah.
We
Do you
see that.
use a cover crop? Is one that just came in.
Yes, yes, we cover crop every single year. And it's in the ground from October till March.
Great. And have you done a yield comparison on a dry farm method versus irrigated?
So that's a common misconception about, that you sacrifice yield for a dry farm vineyard. And no, you do not sacrifice yield in a dry farm vineyard. We drop fruit every year to reach our target of 4 tons per acre. So and there is a difference between dry farming and not irrigating. So my great uncle always used to say that dry farming is a verb, not a noun. So it doesn't mean that you just didn't water the vineyard. So I would assume that if there's situations where maybe if you just didn't water a vineyard and you didn't do the dry farming practices, that you might be sacrificing yield. But no, we haven't seen that at all.
Great. We've just got a few more questions before we transition over to Miguel. One is any experience with the biodegradable water lines they use in Israel and the Middle East for establishing in the first few years?
No, I mean that's a really interesting thing to look at. We do the hand cart, right, with watering by hand, with like that. But there are vineyards. I know Topless Creek in Paso, they lay out irrigation lines, and that's how they water and then roll them back up. So that would be something that's interesting to look at for sure. But I've never seen that happen.
Great. Someone else is asking, how do you capture water?
So with the cultivation practices, so we're creating a sponge. The soil is becoming a sponge, and that's through the disking and the cultivating, and we're able to capture all that moisture, and then it's like we seal it with a dust mulch. So once everything's all we have all the rains, it's almost we break down the soil so there's a dust mulch on the top and it retains the moisture. And you'll go through and you'll cultivate and it's like you're wicking moisture up in the summer.
Great. And then our last question is, how many tillage passes on average do you need to do through the growing season? And what implement do you use after the first pass? Disc only or the hoe plow every time?
So no, so we use the disc and then we'll hoe plow and then we'll disc one more time. So the disc is only twice, and that's when we add an extra blade kind of at the end, and it pushes the dirt back into kind of the trench that the hoe plow made. And then it's a cultivation. We do it, we do every other row after every spray. So think of your growing season and you're spraying every couple weeks. And so every other row, every couple weeks. It's like six, 5 to 6, depending. If we have a really wet year, maybe we won't have to do it as much. If if it's a drought year or it's a dry year, we're really trying to, conserve that moisture, it might be a little more. And Miguel will talk about the soil health of those vineyards because that is a big question that people have and pushback that I've gotten.
That's the perfect transition. Lauren, thanks. That was a lot of questions. Everyone, great job. Keep the questions coming. Love to see it. Yeah, feel free to keep putting them in the chat and the Q&A. Next up is Miguel Garcia. Miguel has been assisting farmers in implementing sustainable farming practices in California since 2016. He has a PhD in environmental sciences and a BS in chemistry from UC Riverside. Miguel is also a certified crop advisor. He provides on-farm technical assistance and planning related to soil health, carbon sequestration, erosion control, and water management. He also designs bilingual education programs aimed at providing local growers and farm workers with valuable information on topics related to sustainable agriculture. Miguel believes the future of our local water resources and the world's food security lies heavily on the implementation of sustainable farming practices today. So take us away, Miguel.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. I am currently collaborating with Lauren and CSW8 on this project. So today I will be sharing the results of our assessment related to soil health and water storage in dry farm vineyards. Considering the water challenges that California farmers are currently facing, including prolonged drought, reduced snowpack, extreme heat, climate uncertainty, and most recently, reductions in water allocations, dry farming offers a management strategy that enhances soil functionality and leverages plant-soil relationships to optimize water storage and improve water use efficiency. And with all of this, ultimately creating more resilient and self-sustaining agricultural systems. What I will share today will give us a little bit of a clue as on how dry farm vineyards can accomplish this. So dry farming has a long history in California agriculture, and many vineyards continue to operate successfully without any in-season irrigation. Dry farming offers a resilient management approach by reducing reliance on irrigation while encouraging deeper rooting and more self-sufficient vines, just like Lauren was sharing earlier. This is the same map that Lauren was sharing, and it's been a long effort to get this map going, and I really encourage you to take a look at it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but as Lauren showed, you can click on each of these vineyards, and not all of these are dry farm, of course, but you can find the dry farm vineyards in here and get a lot of information if you're interested in transitioning into dry farming. So I encourage you to take a look at it. So right now, there is very limited site-specific data on soil health in dry farm vineyards and on the soil properties that control how water is stored and mobilized in these systems. So the main goal of this project was to understand how different dry farming management approaches influence soil health and how soil conditions affect its capacity to store and transport water throughout the soil profile so that dry farming can happen. So for this study, we included 15 vineyards throughout Napa, Sonoma, and Mendocino. There were 2 fields selected per vineyard, so we had a total of 30 different sites where we conducted this study, and this map shows, the red dots show the location of each of those participating fields. We use soil pit sampling to evaluate physical, chemical, and biological properties indicative of soil health, along with soil moisture dynamics throughout the growing season. And we were sampling 3 times during 2025. We did first sampling around bud break, another one during variation, and then our last one was after harvest. At each field, there were 3 soil pits that were excavated, and we were down to 5 feet, and we were collecting samples at 1 foot increment. So we have for every one of the 30 fields that we evaluated, there were 3 pits that were dug. And then from those pits, we collected samples from each of those pits, combined them together for a representative sample, and that's what we send to the lab for analysis. And while we were there, we would actually also taking pictures and making observations. So here you can see how extensive the root system is in dry farm vineyards. These vines cover a much wider area than is in irrigated vineyards. We not only see roots going deep down to 4 or 5 feet, but we also see roots going across between the rows. So these vines are accessing water from a substantially bigger volume of soil than irrigated vines. Lauren was speaking of the soil as a sponge, and that's what farming is. We're using the soil. One of the many properties of the soil is to serve as a sponge to retain water. Well, the size of your sponge will also depend on how deep and how wide your roots can go. So these vines are accessing water from much bigger volume than what the irrigated vines will do just based on the surface area of the roots. So quite fascinating. One of the things we evaluated in the samples collected was soil texture. It affects water movement and storage. Across the participating vineyards, we saw a wide range of soil textures from coarse sandy loams, loamy sands to finer loams, sandy clay loams, and occasionally sandy clay layers. So we saw a little bit of everything. And many of the sites exhibited layer profiles with coarse or fine textures stacked vertically. And these transitions also strongly influences how water infiltration and storage and movement is happening throughout the soil profile. So I'll show you a little bit later how we were looking at how water moves through these different layers. So for these participating vineyards, there's a wide range of soil management approaches. So what Lauren was sharing is the way that they do the farming. But throughout the 15 vineyards that we were sampling, we saw a little bit of everything from no-till to intense tillage systems. Mainly tillage was used for weed control, cover crop incorporation, or like Lauren was mentioning, for moisture management. And the places where there was reduced or no-till, the vine prunings and the cover crop residues were just left on the surface. And in those cases, there was just very minimum disturbance on the soil. We also see a little bit of different approaches when it comes to compost. So Lauren was mentioning how they apply compost every year. We saw that there was variety among the farms. So some of them did not apply compost annually. Others would do it once, twice a year. And the amounts also varied a lot. So 2, 3 tons per acre were about the average that we were seeing. And this diversity of practices allow us to evaluate how soil disturbance intensity and organic inputs and cover crops influence soil health. So this will give us some idea of how the different management approaches are benefiting or influencing soil health and how water is stored in the soil. And since minimizing soil disturbance is one of the pillars of soil health, we were very curious to evaluate how, to what extent the soil disturbance happening in dry farm vineyards is impacting soil functionality. So for these, we measure a suite of soil health indicators to capture how management influences soil function and resilience. Organic matter and total carbon reflect the long-term accumulation of plant inputs and influence water holding capacity. It also affects biological activity, aggregation, fertility. Active carbon, or POC, soil respiration, and potential mineralized nitrogen indicate how much carbon is available to fuel microbial activity and support nutrient release over time. Aggregate stability reflects the soil's resistance to erosion and its capacity to maintain infiltration, while cation change capacity provides insights into nutrient retention. So together, these indicators provide an integrated picture of soil health and its ability to support dry farm systems without in-season irrigation. So basically, these tests are allowing us to assess how the soil is functioning. Is the soil able to fulfill its functions effectively? And if so, we will say that that soil is healthy. And then we're trying to see how the different management approaches affect how the soil is able to perform these vital functions. So looking at the soil health results, most of the fields scored within or above expected ranges, with only a minor number scoring lower. And we are comparing these results to a database that the North Coast Soil Health Hub has developed in vineyard soil. So we have over 600 soil samples that we've collected over the years in North Coast Vineyard. So we're using that as a reference point. So based on that, we're seeing that the majority of the samples that we analyze are scoring at or higher than what we are seeing for the averages in our database. So this is really good news. And this raises two central questions: whether the management practices are driving differences in soil health, and whether these small amount of vineyards that have lower soil health scores, would they also have limited water movement and storage? And we saw that tillage emerged as an important factor in some of the low scoring fields, but not all of them. So there was not a strong direct correlation between tillage and having low scores, because we have some fields like Lawrence that are actively tilling, but they have really good soil health indicators. So generally speaking, frequent disturbance tends to break down soil aggregates, accelerates organic carbon loss, and reduces long-term organic matter stability. So in general, this is what we see with high disturbance. But at the same time, we know that compost inputs and higher cover crop biomass are expected to counteract some of these negative effects. So that's exactly what we're seeing here, where the intense tillage may be affecting soil structure, but the large amount of compost and biomass appear to be just counteracting the negative effects. So that being said, these results do suggest that there is room for improvement on some of these vineyards that have lower soil health scores, particularly, where the scores are lower. We see that reducing tillage may be a higher priority for improving soil health and resilience. So for these vineyards that are scoring a little bit lower, yes, there might be some room for improvement if they were to reduce the tillage. However, to what extent we will see benefits and whether it's worth it, and whether the benefits are greater than the drawbacks, that's a question that we might not be able to answer just with this study. But we're seeing that there is some room for improvement. So that brings us to the next question. So addressing the question of whether lower soil health scores translate into a limited ability to store water. So again, we see that there might be some room for improvement on these vineyards that have lower soil health scores. But the question is, are these lower soil health scores necessarily preventing the soil from doing its job properly? Meaning, yes, we would definitely recommend changes. Well, across all fields, across every single one of them, water storage falls within or above expected ranges. And this is just based on soil texture. So just looking at the individual soil textures, we were looking at what these soils should be able to do when it comes to water retention. And we're seeing that every single one of them is scoring at or above. So this indicates that the soils are functioning at or above their physical capacity for water storage. So in that case, for me as an advisor, I would not necessarily push the idea of reducing tillage, because we're seeing that the soils are doing a really good job at storing water. Now the question is, if you reduce tillage farther, would that mean that it would store even more water? And would that be worth it? That's another question that we could answer on a different study. But just given this information, there is nothing for me to prompt those farmers to say, yeah, you need to stop the tillage or change your tillage. And this is all because they're also doing compost and they're also doing cover cropping. So if we didn't find a single field where there was only tillage with no compost and no cover crop at all. So this is just showing that combining different practices can have a net improvement in soil health. For these, we also compared the measured soil moisture at bloom. So we measure the amount of moisture at bloom, and then we compare that to the estimated field capacity to assess whether the winter rainfall was sufficient to fully recharge the profile. And then we also compare the post-harvest soil moisture to the permanent wilting point to evaluate whether the stored soil water was enough to meet the demand of the vines during the season. So the field capacity is the maximum amount of water that the soil can hold after excess water has drained. And the permanent wilting point is the minimum amount of moisture that can remain in the soil before the plant can no longer survive. So we saw that winter rainfall did not always fully recharge the soils to field capacity. And then at the end of the season, conditions were a little bit varied. We saw some fields retaining residual plant available moisture and others approaching sort of like that extraction limit. So these tell us that all dry farm vineyards that we evaluated are able to provide the water that the vines need, but some operate under much tighter margins than others. So some have a little bit more of a buffer to provide the water that the plants need. This here shows how moisture changed by depth throughout the year from bud break to after harvest. We noticed that for some depths, we ended up with more moisture after harvest than in the middle of the year. Some of the vineyards got a little bit of rain before we did the last sampling, and that could explain this gaining moisture at the top layers, but not at the lower depths. And we saw the same pattern even in vineyards that got no rain prior to the last sampling. So this is not due to rain. What this shows is an upward redistribution of moisture from lower layers into top layers as the plants start using less water and the soil starts drying up towards the end of the season. This is another example where we saw the same pattern. So across sides, there's a consistent seasonal pattern where the upper soil horizon dries first as the canopy demand increases, while the deeper layers retain moisture longer and function as a late season water reservoir. So by harvest, we see two general outcomes. Some fields approach or fall below the permanent wilting point, reflecting some strong late season water use and maybe a higher potential for plant water stress. And then others retain moisture in deeper horizons, providing a buffer later in the season. At several sites, we observe small increases in soil moisture at certain depths late in the season, even with no rain. So this suggests that water stored deeper in the soil can slowly move upward, either through the soil itself or with the help of plant roots, especially as vines begins to slow the water use late in the season. So as a result of these, deep soil moisture can remain accessible to the plants. So this was kind of surprising to see that we ended up with a little bit more moisture in some sites at some depths after the season ended. And for our project, we were looking at 3 snapshots. So we were collecting samples 3 times during the year. We were not measuring moisture continuously. Perhaps if we would have captured some of those dynamic changes. But as an overall water budget, we're seeing that there is moisture remaining at the end of the season. And there are clues to show that that moisture is coming from deeper layers. So not only are these roots accessing water from a bigger volume of soil, they are accessing water from deeper within the soil profile than where even the roots are. So in summary, the soils in the majority of the vineyards we looked at are functioning the way that healthy soils do, storing water efficiently. Tilling does not seem to be significantly impacting the ability of the soil to store and mobilize water. And we think this is because compost and cover crops are also happening at the same time. A question remains whether these soils would perform considerably better if tilling would be eliminated completely. And this is perhaps a topic of another study. We also found that soils often start the growing season not completely full of water, or at least that's what we saw for the last season, which makes winter rainfall and good infiltration especially important. As the season progresses, deeper soil layers become the main water source for vines, and by harvest, many fields are using nearly all the water they store early in the year. So another question that we could address on a follow-up study would be if reducing tillage will improve infiltration in a significant way, and whether the act of tilling has any role in this redistribution of moisture that we are observing. So those are questions that we cannot answer with the data that we collected, but perhaps this could be the framework for a different study. Taken together, these results show that dry farm vineyard soils act like natural water reservoirs, working in step with natural rainfall and seasonal water cycles. And this work shows that dry farm soils can reliably capture winter rainfall, store it in the soil profile, and sustain vines throughout the growing season, making dry farming a practical and resilient strategy for a water-limited future. And with that, I thank you for your attention and welcome any questions you may have.
That's great. Thank you so much, Miguel. Super interesting research and really great to get to learn a little bit about the trials. There's been a little bit of back and forth in the chat about measuring soil moisture. Do you see vineyards doing this? Is this something you're advising people on?
So what is typical in just generally in farming is the use of soil moisture probes. So these are probes that you would install and they will go all the way down and you can measure the moisture changes throughout the season. We decided against that and to use soil pits, which would not be typically the way that we would recommend to do this, because we also wanted to make observations of how the soil looks, where the root systems are, and to be able to collect samples also for the soil health indicators. So the moisture probes are going in the ground, but that doesn't allow us a window, pun intended, into how the soil looks as this is happening. So no, I would not necessarily recommend as a general farming practice to do these soil pits to track soil moisture throughout the year. If somebody's interested on how water dynamics change throughout the season, soil moisture probes would be a much better way to go about it. Since this was a research project and we're trying to investigate at a deeper level, how is it that moisture is changing in the soils, we just wanted to go with the soil pits, and that provided us with a lot of information and a visual representation of what's really happening. So with this, we hope that we can bring this information to general, the general knowledge and to farmers and use it in conjunction with those that are using soil moisture probes.
Thanks, that's helpful to understand. Someone else is asking, are the moisture percentages on your graphs measuring the volumetric water content?
Yes. So we're looking at, we're sending samples directly to the lab as they come out of the ground, and they're doing it as a volumetric way.
Great, thank you. And then one last question before we turn it over to Chad. Did no-till practices impair the success of dry farmed crops?
So based on what we're seeing for this study, and this is a question that we had when we began the project, because we know that as Lauren was explaining, tilling in some instances for dry farming is used as a tool to manage moisture. And we can see that based on the data that we collected, that it is not negatively impacting the soil. So, and this is mainly because it's being used in conjunction with compost and cover crops. So whether this is a question that remains up in the air, whether the actual tilling is changing those dynamics on the way that the water is moving through the soil. So basically to say it is not creating a negative impact, but is it creating a positive role? It's creating a benefit. That's something that the data that we collected does not let us know. However, it was definitely reassuring to see that combining tilling with the compost and the cover cropping tends to have a positive benefit on soil health. We did see that the highest scores on soil health were from the vineyards that were not being tilled. So that does also show that perhaps there is a price to pay per se for the amount of tilling that is happening, but the way that is being carried in dry farm vineyards, it's not creating a negative impact on the soil to the point that an advisor that me would urge the farmer to make any changes. Based on the data that we saw, I will not tell any of the farmers that we work with that they needed to make any changes. So with that said, whether it is improving the productivity or not, that's something that I think the farming perspective, so hearing from Lauren, hearing from Chad, would be important, but also to recognize that every field is different, every operation is different. So in order to really understand what would work and to what extent, it's important to repeat these sort of assessments at each of these sites. We are sort of creating the database and creating a reference point that others can use. But the reality of it is that these practices can have different levels of impact in different fields.
And we've talked about it quite a few times, Miguel and I, about how this doesn't mean that like if you just till, I mean, you can till and have an unhealthy soil, right? There's practices out there that are, over tilling and not putting amendments back into the soil and not planting the cover crop, not putting in compost. So there's definitely, it's not to say that like, oh yeah, go ahead, till, like your soils will be healthy, right? But the way that the dry farm vineyards that Miguel was looking at were also, putting in those additions into those, things into the soils, right? That they were able to have healthy soils and do the tillage practices. But it's not saying that all tillage practices will create healthy soils.
And if we're at a point where the tilling and the cultivating is what is allowing you to dry farm, then all I would say is make sure that you recognize that it does have a negative impact so that don't don't stop doing your cover cropping, don't stop doing your compost. So if you really rely on tilling, it is even more important for you to make sure that you continue doing compost and the cover cropping. And if you do that, based on what we're seeing here, you will have very healthy soils.
Thank you both. And I was going to turn it over to Chad, but Chad, you asked this question, so we'll sneak it in before we start yours. Did you measure soil microbial activity in till versus no till specifically in the summer?
So all of the measurements that we did for soil health happening in the spring. And for biological activity, we want to make sure the soil is moist and that, the soils are, the weather is getting a little bit warmer. So intentionally, we do those measurements during the spring. It would have been different if we would have gone during the summer for sure. And I would not, I don't have a reference point to even predict how it would be different between the till versus the no till. But that's an interesting question that maybe we can consider for a different study.
Future research to come. Well, with that, we're going to turn it over to Chad Tabor. Chad studied wine and viticulture at Cal Poly and has spent the last 22 years working in vineyards and wineries. He is celebrating his 10th vintage working at Adelaida Vineyard in Paso Robles, where he is the ranch manager, viticulturist, and pest control advisor. Take it away, Chad.
Hi, everyone. I just really wanted to say thank you to Lauren and Miguel. I really like talking about dry farming, and it's something that I've only really got a chance to more broadly talk about with people in the last few years with Lauren seemingly dragging me into a few of these things, which I've been really happy to be able to do. We in Paso Robles, we have really varying degrees of slope and rainfall here. For us, we're farming on anything from about 15-degree slope to 40-degree slopes, all on limestone, mostly kind of clay soils. So we are able to retain a lot of water in subsurface soils. And just a couple other metrics for you guys. I would say there is no such thing as an average rainfall here for us. But I looked back at the last 3 years for us, and 18 inches is where we've been in the last 3 years. That's ranging from 13 to 25 inches. So last year we only got 13 inches of rain. And what I would call kind of a no-brainer, if we get 15 inches of rain, I can successfully dry farm a healthy vineyard year after year. We also have been farming, I should say, multiple generations have been farming this land for the last 100+ years, dry farming, whether that was walnuts that are still in the ground today. So we have 100+ year old walnuts that are still in the ground producing walnuts. And I have a 1964 planting of Pinot Noir, which we currently farm. And that's had various farmers go through it, multiple generations of people that spent years farming these places and consistently doing dry farming techniques. We farm 150 acres wine grapes and around 500 acres of dry farm walnuts. One thing that is a little different for me is I don't only just dry farm. I have head trained vineyards where we established grapevines for the first 2 years with putting in risers and putting out drip for the first 2 years. And we did that because we established 22 acres at a time. And, another decade after, we did another 10 or 20 acres at a time. So we do full install, and we put it on the ground and then roll it up after those couple of years are over. And I'm not so married to only letting Mother Nature control the narrative. So there's years we've talked about rolling out hose again, where we've only received 7 inches of rain, and maybe that the year that preceded that was not a big rainfall year either. So if we have big drought spans, I'm not afraid to put water back out in the field. Our main goal is to conserve water year after year. And that's not just us trying to be really conservative. It's because we don't have a lot of water. Historically, there's not a lot of water out here. And that's why there's so many dry farmers on the west side of Paso Robles. They didn't have water. They couldn't flood irrigate because we're on such big slopes. They were tilling these orchards with teams of horses 100 years ago. There weren't wells with electricity out there pumping water out there. So what I wanted to talk about more was kind of the actual process of us cultivating vineyards. And what we do is a minimum of 5 total passes in the field. And we will go up to, excuse my dog wrestling back there, up to 13 passes. And some of these we have really wide set rows, 12-foot rows, which means sometimes we have double passes for one activity. Because on our terrain, we have different orientations even through a row, where we're going up, down, and different cambers in both directions. So we can't put a tiller in there that's exactly the right size. The pictures that you guys were looking at in dry farm vineyards were relatively flat compared to what we're farming. We're also in a Winkler region 5, which is the warmest region for kind of wine grape production. And in another decade, with temperature models, we're projected to be just outside of premium wine grape growing temperatures. But that doesn't frighten me as much as other people because of the dry farming techniques we have. So I'll go over what we're doing. We're getting in there as soon as the soil is dry enough to work. And that will start with shredding canes in a cover cropped row. Every row is cover cropped every year, tilling those canes and immediately tilling that under. I want to do it within a day of mowing. So timing for us is the most critical portion of all dry farming, and it's probably one of the negatives of dry farming is how intense this short window is to get the job done really well. And we're doing this over 150 acres with a few guys. So we're going full out this whole time. So we put the green manure under the ground, which gives us a really nice big bump in nutrition and microbial activity, and we're turning it totally to dirt. We're doing the same thing with undervine cultivation. So we're using largely a Clemens weed knife and undercutting that and turning that to soil as well. So when you look at my fields in June, when we're all done, or July, you'll look at completely bare tilled ground that has a dust mulch of about 10 inches deep. And our goal is to basically be walking on the moon. You know, we want, when you're running down these 40-degree slopes, you can kind of just bound down them. And it's really soft. And that means we've done a really good job. So in order to do that, we make this first tilling pass where we're creating large aggregate. We're creating large structure of clods of dirt. That's our first pass. And I want to let that dry down. That might be 2 weeks, that might be 3 weeks, but I always have a rest period where I'm not just running up and down until this soil is at the consistency that we're looking for. We're trying to break all structure in the first 10 inches to create this dust mulch. And that, like Lauren was talking about, is creating this barrier that's there that is wicking moisture up and also just sealing that upper portion of soil. And when you go below that 10 inches, you'll see really nice moisture in the middle of June, July. You can reach down and not see a compacted layer. You can dig it out with your hands and see worms down there and hold that soil and have compaction in there with being able to grip it. You have moisture in the soil, which is what we're after. So after the 2 weeks, we're running back through with a faster, lighter disc and breaking up that large aggregate into smaller aggregate. We're waiting another 2 weeks to even a month, and then running a perfecta or a spring tooth, something to basically smooth out the soil. And that's going to have a drag behind it to completely smooth that soil out and create really as fine of a dust mulch as we can. And we've found that to be the most successful for preserving water. And that's more or less our cultivation passes. When we have really big rain years like we have in the last few years, we can have cover crop that's 5 feet tall. I mean, you can stand in there and kind of get lost and have huge muster. And that's why we have these mowing passes that go in before the disc. And why I believe that we see such healthy, vigorous vines year after year is because we're putting all of that green manure in the soil while it is green, not while it's brown and dry. We're putting in as soon as possible to get microbial activity to break that down. And you'll go back and there's nothing left of this material that we're putting under the ground. So we have really high microbial activity in rapid shoot growth period, which gives us really nice shoot growth early on. And if anyone is used to growing grapevines, there comes a time where we can't grow more canes. Yeah, we can't grow canes any higher. We start to get into July. No matter how much water you put on there, you're not going to get grapevines to go and touch the ground. So we struggle with having too much vigor at times when doing farming these grapevines. And so I do no-till in select portions to where I have flatter regions or flatter areas in the vineyard. I don't till all the way down. I till to that point where we know we have over vigor problems, and that becomes a no-till section. I've done crimping with that. So I'm not totally married to it being a one solution for dry farming. For if it's tilling to where it gives us the soil moisture that we need, that's what we're after. If it's just leaving it alone and mowing and leaving full cover under there, that's what I would prefer. Tilling a vineyard doesn't make our life any easier. It conserves water, bottom line, and creates healthy vineyards for us. That's why we choose to do it. We have 22 varieties that we farm in Paso Robles in a warm region. Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, typically more coastal vineyards are growing these, and we have no issue growing high quality Pinot Noir, which a big portion of this is the limestone in our soil. We have really high pH alkaline soils that retain really nice must acid and provide balance in wines and structure. So in really warm regions, most people would get more of a flabby Pinot Noir out of something like that. So we're growing the gamut of varieties, Pinot to Cabernet in our vineyards. So this might bring me to my next point, being I don't only farm vineyards that don't have irrigation. I do have drip in, let's call it 60% of our vineyards, but I dry farm style everything. I treat it like I'm not going to give it water. And some years we don't. I have portions of my vineyard that the irrigation system is shut off or that never get turned on. But I have the ability to put water on. And when I will do that is through winter. If we don't have rainfall through the winter, I'll put water on during the winter, but I am trying to mimic rainfall as much as I can. I'm putting on, 24 to 48 hours of irrigation, which translates to 12 or 24 gallons. And I may do that at the most 4 times per year. So winter sets, pre-bud break, and post-veraison, post-harvest. Those will be the only times that I irrigate. So I'm not irrigating through heat events at all. When I'm doing these practices with tilling, that water that's preserved under there, whether it's from Mother Nature or me putting it in the ground, I'm preserving that water that's now under the ground for grapevines to use. And we do not irrigate, even if it's 110 degrees out, which doesn't happen very often, but it can. We do not irrigate through heat events. And I think that says a lot for this practice is we don't panic. We don't worry about really what is coming. These vines roll through heat events with no issue. I don't see leaves turning away. I have lateral growth still occurring, and we do monitor soil moisture with Thule or CropX now, and just soil moisture probes. So I can kind of look at it and say where we're at and where we want to be. there's a lot of great points that Lauren brought up with pest pressure. Gophers, like she was talking about. I only work gophers in young vineyards. We don't work gophers in anything that's maybe 5 years or so until we would maybe give up taking care of gophers. And there are gopher mounds everywhere. And so it's something, because these vines are deeper and they're accessing water deeper than where gophers are really living. We have, I think, another really positive benefit to reduced irrigation or no irrigation is vine mealybug is something not everybody loves to talk about having in their vineyards. Our vineyards, and probably 60% of our vineyards that we have, I have vine mealybug. What I don't have is an abundance of ants, because we're not supplying regular water to ants. And Argentine ants especially are really aggressive at taking care of vine mealybug and protecting them. And we have really low populations that allows me to do predatory releases. And it's really successful. I don't have vine mealybug in my fruit. We keep really low levels. And it's something that I didn't really realize until I brought out Copert, which is an insectary. And they were like, "Whoa, what's going on here?" I said, "I don't know. I suppose it's because we don't irrigate." So I was really impressed with that being something that every vineyard I'd ever been in, besides this vineyard, we had vine mealybug problems, and ants were one of the number one things that are moving these things and protecting them. So I really love that about dry farming. Besides being very simple, it's cutting out any herbicides. This ranch hasn't used herbicides for 20 years. We've been certified organic since 2018. So we don't use herbicides at all, insecticides, anything. We're also organic. So you have broad spectrum oils and things like that. That's all I'm using as insecticides, is what goes essentially into my fungicide program. Besides doing releases of predatory insects. So it's a really simple approach to farming, reduced labor with no irrigation going on throughout the year, or limited. And we do it because it works. That's why we do it. I would gladly abandon tilling every single row to just have a vineyard that I didn't have to till for. But we find that it's wildly successful and has produced healthy grapevines for 60 years. We have the second oldest Pinot Noir in California.
Todd, thank you so much for that summary. We've got just about 5 minutes left here, so I want to make sure we get some of the questions. We've got a lot of stuff coming in. And if we don't get to answer your question, please feel free to follow up with us after the fact. We'll put emails and stuff in the chat and send them out. But one question that just sort of is perfectly timed for what you were just talking about. Do you use more products/inputs in your vineyards than growers that use irrigation, more compost, more fertilizer? And we'll just sort of open this up for anyone who wants to chime in on that, but start with you, Chad.
We do not really compost. I compost, and you probably get about 30 tons from the largest winery that we sell to. And so I compost that and I put it out in my weakest areas. We do not we don't have a compost program where I regularly add compost. I've had sheep in the vineyard a couple of times. I would really love to continue doing that. It becomes a bit of a challenge getting the timing correct. And with the wine industry the way it is right now, I'm trying to cut as much as I can out of the budget. But I do not add anything. I don't add nitrogen. I'll do some acid injections because I have really high pHs to try to free up available nutrients in that snapshot of, say, veraison when I want to take up potassium. I do really minimal, if not minimalist, inputs in that way. And I farm things that produce 1 ton to the acre. That's this 1964 Pinot to I've had 10 tons to the acre for Grenache Blanc that we're growing.
Thanks, Chad. And you had chatted a little bit about your tillage practices. Someone's asking, how do you prevent erosion in a heavy storm on tilled slopes?
Yes, it's one of the biggest negatives on it. What we do and what works 9 times out of 10 is one of the beauties about having this tillage is you are ready made to for your seed bank. So I often will do nothing besides after harvest. One of the guys gets off a harvest crew and he starts driving the seeder. He's in there. So as soon as we are done with harvest and we have the chance of these first rains that'll hit in early November, we are ready to get that cover crop started. And so we're putting that in the ground immediately after harvest. So we pray that there is a gentle rain, 1 to 2 inches for those first rains. We have gotten bit in the butt where we've had, 6-10 inches of rain in a week. And that can be really problematic. But knowing your vineyard and doing erosion control at the beginning, especially with these really steep slopes, knowing those spots, and I'm putting straw out, I'm doing wattles. We're doing everything we can to minimize erosion like this. But yes, it's one of the reasons it would be nice to do less. But we're really fluffing up that top layer. We can absorb a lot of water before runout.
Great. And this will be our last question. Sorry if we weren't able to get to your question, but again, feel free to follow up afterwards. Do dry farming vineyards use different pruning patterns on vines than irrigated? If so, what are those patterns?
I'm sorry, I did not hear the last part of the question very well.
Do you use different pruning patterns than on dry land than irrigated?
Oh, pruning patterns?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So we have traditional head train gobelet. That's our dry farm vineyards. We typically do that almost. That's so we can do a diamond pattern planting and make a 3-way crossing across the vineyard. I have cane prune vines and I have cordon train vines, all bilateral. For the most part, I have some unilateral cordon out there as well to experiment with some sap float pruning. But yes, we are tilling like this in a modified VSP as well as doing just head trained kind of bush vines.
Us too. So we do head train gobelet style in some of our vineyards, and then we have a very modern trellis system that we're able to do as well. The gobelet style is nice because, like Chad, you can do cross cultivation in the beginning, and it's good. But you would think of it as in any normal vineyard in Napa, except for the lack of irrigation lines.
Yeah, we're at 345 vines per acre to 1361.
Well, unfortunately, we're at time. Clearly, there's more conversation to be had, a big, wide world of dry farming out there. So thank you so much to our panelists. Thanks for joining us today, and please stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.